Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. Emmanuel Macron has been returned to the Élysée Palace for a second term as president. But just what has this election taught us about the future of France and its role on the global stage? With just over 58% of the vote, Emmanuel Macron has been returned as president of France, beating Marine Le Pen in a repeat of the poll in 2017. But there were some significant differences this time around, with Le Pen performing markedly better than she did 5 years ago. Turnout was also the lowest for a presidential runoff since 1969. And of those who did bother to head to the polling station, a full 3 million cast spoilt or blank ballots. So what does this mean for the future of France and for France's role within the EU and on the global stage? Joining me now from the French capital are political journalist Laure Cometti and Douglas Yates, Doctor of Political Science at the American Graduate School in Paris. Laure, to you first. What did you make of the result?
Well, as you said, the one interesting point is that the gap between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen has narrowed as compared to the past election 5 years ago, which seems to indicate that the Republican front, what we call in France the Republican front, meaning the fact that voters from all parties will ally and support the other candidate in order to block the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen. This Republican front seems to be a little bit damaged over the years. And also, as you said, the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen has increased her number of ballots as compared to 2017, and the abstention is quite high, almost a historical record.
And Douglas, it seemed to many commentators that the French public didn't really want either, but they wanted one slightly less than the other.
Yeah, it was a case of the lesser of two evils. There were many who decided to abstain. The abstention was very interesting. It was extremely high. The young abstained, the poor abstained, people who see themselves in disfavored categories abstained, and people who had voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the first round abstained. And this was the strongest censure you could give to both of the candidates, neither one nor the other. Many of those voters said they were given a choice between cholera and the plague.
That's very cruel. Laure, do you see this as a protest vote?
Well, actually, yes. The abstention can be, well, it depends. I mean, each voter has his or her own motivations. But the abstention can be a sign of protest or a sign of indifference. And what we have seen in France, as in other democracies around the world, is that many people do not believe anymore that politics and politicians can have a positive impact on their life, which produces a very high abstention. And also some polls suggest that actually almost 42% of people who voted for Emmanuel Macron on Sunday voted for him in order to defeat Marine Le Pen. But on the other hand, 56% of people who voted for Marine Le Pen voted for her in order to defeat Emmanuel Macron. So it seems that there are really two blocs that don't really stand each other. But we must not forget that actually one of the biggest parties in France is the abstention party.
Laure, staying with you, it may be the first time a governing president of the Fifth Republic has been re-elected, but many commentators seem to think that Mr. Macron, President Macron, has a very tough road ahead of him. Do you agree?
Well, of course, because even though it's a victory and a clear victory, because of course he's 17 points ahead of Marine Le Pen, which is not too bad considering that some polls in the past weeks predicted a much narrower gap between them. So it's a clear victory, but at the same time with pretty tough challenges, because when he was elected 5 years ago, Emmanuel Macron made this promise that he would reconcile the French people and French voters with their institutions and with the democratic practices. And well, it seems that he's not there yet, and that the road might get even more difficult. And also with the inflation and the fuel prices skyrocketing, the crisis and maybe the purchasing power issue can think that there might be a risk of social protests or rallies, as we have seen in 2018 with the Yellow Vests.
Douglas, a challenging road ahead for President Macron. The economy, the cost of living, that was the big domestic issue, wasn't it? How big an issue do you think that will be on the road going ahead for Macron?
Well, in the short term, it remains the main issue because of the high cost of living caused by, in part, the war in Ukraine, increasing fuel crisis, but largely also because the United States government has been pumping trillions of dollars into the world economy. And this inflation that we're now experiencing globally is structured. Emmanuel Macron can do very little about that. So this will continue to weigh on him. And we're going to see in the short term, this is going to remain a big issue in the legislative elections. And I think what he's got to do is he's got to continue his campaign. He's got to go out, continue to shake hands, continue to dive into the crowds. If he goes into the Élysée Palace and does foreign policy and with his technocrats implements a series of reforms, there will be protests on the street. Because the cost of living is high and people are suffering.
I mean, he basically has to win over the young, doesn't he?
In part, the young don't like him. The young largely are more to the left than the vast middle-aged voting body and the older. He had a lot of support among the elderly, and the young were voting Mélenchon. They're more progressive. They're for homosexual rights. They're for protecting the environment. They're for anti-globalist, anti-capitalist ideas, as well as generally, like the young, rejecting institutions. He can't really win them over, but he was able to convince them that he's better than what the baby boomers want, using this generational argument, which is something xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and populist, which is what Marine Le Pen offers.
And certainly over 60s, Laure voted for President Macron. 40% of the under 25s eligible to vote didn't vote. That's significant, isn't it?
That's very significant, but it's consistent with what we have seen in France for the past years and past decades, with a turnout getting lower and lower, especially among the young.
Is that dangerous for democracy, Laure?
Well, of course, one cannot really be happy to see that 30 million voters chose not to vote on Sunday. But it seems that the younger generations, they vote less than the elderly, but maybe they commit to other kind of citizen engagement, like joining an association or going out in the streets to protest for and defend the climate.
What lessons are there then to be learnt from this election? Do you think we've seen the last of the Republican and Socialist parties, or will they be back?
All right, so it is a nail in the coffin of the Socialist and Republican parties. The traditional institutional parties that have governed this country during the Fifth Republic find themselves in the worst position that they've ever been in. However, it's solely in the presidential election that they're down under 5%. They're very well entrenched in the local governments, in the regional governments, in the departments, in the administration. And so those parties are not going to disappear. But unless they find a way of generating support behind a charismatic leader, they will continue to perform poorly in the presidential elections. One of the big lessons for these parties is not that there is a new tripartite division, an electoral realignment, but that they've got to stop their leadership battles. you've had a series of betrayals in both the Socialist and the Republican Party that have led to fragmentation and splintering into factions. And their voters have drifted away to candidates who offer something more unified. On the left, the lesson is clear. With their minority position, the left must unify behind a single candidate. That candidate for the moment, for better or worse, is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And on the right, the Republicans are doing some soul searching. About half of them always seemed willing to compromise with the xenophobic views of the National Front. And the other half seem to have a more pro-business sense. There, we've got a fragment, and Eric Zemmour has shown that it's not Le Pen, but it's those views that are representative of the new right in France. And I think those are the lessons.
Laure, do you see it like that as well? I mean, I think what you're saying is you need a bit more charisma at the top with these party leaders.
I agree with Douglas. The two traditional parties in France still have a strong local presence in the country, and they won't disappear tomorrow. But they do have a crisis of both identity, because, as you said, the right-wing party is a bit trapped between, is hesitating between two roads. Should they go towards a more moderate wing, pro-business, but with the risk of being absorbed by Emmanuel Macron, because they are very close in terms of program? Or should they choose a more radical path, but with the risk of being absorbed by the National Rally or Eric Zemmour's party? And this crisis of identity is accentuated by the crisis of leader, because, of course, neither the left party, the Socialist Party, or the right-wing party, Les Républicains, neither of these two parties have found the perfect leader to both incarnate this identity and choose a path, a clear path.
And Douglas, Marine Le Pen was a lot closer this time around than she was last time, or at least her party was a lot closer. Can she get closer still next time around?
Yeah, I believe there's a storm on the horizon. And in 2027, in 5 years, with the way that she's implanted individuals in the territories of the East, the North, and the South, and now in the basin around Bordeaux, she's going to have electoral machines that could build up for her a first round advantage. And if there hadn't been a candidate of Eric Zemmour, we might have seen her be the leading candidate through this whole election year. That would have changed the turnout and would have changed the motivation. So yeah, if you were to draw lines between the points of the election of the former National Front in 2002 up until now, you would see, if you interpolated between those points, you would see a line going up and to the right. And the prediction for 2027 would be something like 48, 49%. And therefore, if we want to attribute her loss this time, we could thank Eric Zemmour for that.
The fact that she's now mixing in polite company and the extreme anti-immigrant stance is now being discussed in mainstream politics, that means she's come a long way, doesn't it, in terms of acceptance for the French public and French politics?
Well, it's true that Marine Le Pen has partly managed to appear as more moderate. Well, she changed the name of the party in 2018. She cannot change her name, but she changed the name of the party. And but the influence, the indirect influence of Eric Zemmour has also played a part, I think, because he acted very radical during this campaign, and somehow Marine Le Pen managed to appear as a more moderate face of nationalism and far right in France.
We'll pause there, but do stay with us. Still to come here on the agenda, a victory for Europe. We'll consider what Macron's success might mean for the future of the EU. Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
And welcome back to this Agenda Election Special and our look at the future of France after the re-election of Emmanuel Macron for a second term as president. Still with me are political journalist Laure Cometti and Douglas Yates, who is Doctor of Political Science at the American Graduate School in Paris. Douglas, Macron has said he's going to be, quote, president for everyone. Now, he obviously said that on the campaign trail, so you don't always believe what politicians say on the campaign trail. But do you think that's possible?
No, he is perceived, and rightfully so, as the president of the rich. His main reforms that he is stubbornly going to pursue with, prolonging the work years before retirement, making people who are on the unemployment lists find some kind of work or be cut off from their support, continuing with good environmental programs that will largely be, the cost of which will largely be unfairly distributed to the poor and the working class. Policy after policy of his neoliberal agenda is not for everybody. That he's going to create a France that will make the winners win and the losers lose. And if he's foolish and he believes he has a mandate to pursue that program, there will be protests in the streets.
So the Gilets jaunes, they're law to come. We'll see a lot more people on the streets. So can President Macron avoid that? Can he be a president for everyone? Is France too polarized?
Well, France has appeared very polarized these past years. And of course, the pandemics sort of froze this social ebullition and social protesting that was going on in the country. So it's hard to predict in a post-COVID context how will people react? Will they go out in the streets again? I think there is a possibility, of course.
I think it's a very likely possibility, isn't it?
Yes, because the reform that Macron wants to implement, for instance, for the pensions, is a very explosive reform. And before the COVID, his reform has made thousands of people go out in the streets in France. So it's a very explosive topic. I think we'll have to, the next days and also the legislative elections will be very interesting because we have to wait and see what government Emmanuel Macron appoints. Will he incorporate personalities from other parties and show signs of, openness and signs that he would not just implement his program, but take into account the fact that many voters voted for him, not really out of 100% support for his program. And another big challenge might be the reform of the institutions. But it's a delicate reform too, and it's not even sure that this kind of reform would reconcile French people with their institutions.
Douglas, how important are the parliamentary elections now?
They're extremely important. What Emmanuel Macron did in 2017 was he created a party out of nothing. And that's what his party is. It's a nothing party. It's not well entrenched anywhere in the territory of France. And what he's got is a rubber stamp parliament, and it gives him bad habits like an authoritarian ruler. He presents a policy that's deeply unpopular. His advisors and consultants tell him he can push it through, and then he presents it without having to convince Parliament. Parliament is there to serve a function, and it's not been serving that function. So what these legislative elections can do is they can give him an actual parliamentary opposition. And if he acts poorly over the next 8 weeks and begins to announce his neoliberal reforms, he might push voters into voting for a national union, which would combine together Zemmour, Le Pen, and right-wing Les Républicains into a true opposition party or he might push people to the left. I don't believe he will appoint a prime minister from either the Rassemblement National or from the France Insoumise, because I don't think he would look good next to a real politician that was charismatic. He's likely to pick another technocrat like Jean Castex, someone who won't take any of his glow and will obey him. And that's, of course, the great danger in the French Fifth Republic, which is a presidential monarchy.
And Laure, do you agree with that?
Well, about the parliamentary election, I just want to add that 5 years ago, the abstention was 50%. So not a huge turnout. But they are very, very important elections because mainly because they are the election that decides how much public money the parties will get for the next 5 years. For instance, Emmanuel Macron's party gets 20 million euros per year, more or less, because of the results they had 5 years ago at the last parliamentary elections. So these elections are crucial, but the French voters do not seem to be very interested in this election. And of course, what the opposition want to do, for instance, Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen, as Douglas said, they are hoping to have high results in 8 weeks in order to be strong at the Assembly and maybe be a stronger opposition for the next 5 years. But that's a huge challenge given the possibilities of a higher abstention.
Douglas, President Macron said he thought the future of not just France, but Europe was at stake in this election. Do you think he's right, or was he over-egging the pudding?
Well, after Brexit, the unbelievable departure of Britain from the European Union, the next threat was Frexit. And the European Union would have been a League of Nations of the 21st century if Marine Le Pen had been inside it. So clearly he's going to work with Scholz, and he's going to make sure that the Franco-German axis remains the core of European integration. He wants to pursue with some of the necessary policies of Europe. The energy transition is one of them, and another is trying to move towards common fiscal policy. I don't think anything remarkable will happen in the next 5 years, but Europe will continue in the direction of deeper integration because of Emmanuel Macron.
You don't think he might want to step into Angela Merkel's footsteps and lead Europe?
Oh, I think he would love to do that. But the problem is right now, many of the countries in Europe, particularly the new members, are going themselves through a populist phase. And so he's going to be running up against opposition. And he's shown so far very principled stands against what's happening in Hungary, against what's happening in Poland. But those principled stands make enemies. Angela Merkel was always willing to compromise when it came to the East politic, and it doesn't look like Macron
Certainly she did
is.
if it involved getting free gas or cheaper gas, let's put it that way. Laure, has Mr. Macron's victory ended any talk of Frexit?
Well, I think most certainly, because it's no mystery that Emmanuel Macron is really strongly pro-European and totally against any idea of Brexit. And so I think he will move towards more European integration and more European projects, such as the project of a European defense or a European health sovereignty.
Well, European defence is most interesting, isn't it? Especially with what is going and what is happening next door. Douglas, do you think Macron's vision of greater military and economic autonomy for the EU will get a big boost from President Macron?
Yeah, so France is the #6 military spender in the world. Britain, #5, and now Germany is starting to prime the pump at 7. Between the three of them, we've got about 7% of world military expenditures. All three of them are talking about increasing those expenditures. I believe the war in Ukraine has pushed them towards a realization that they cannot simply count on the Americans to defend them, that Europe cannot be without defense. So yes, now whether that will take the form of a Europe of defense, I'm not sure, because the United States acts as a spoiler. And the United States is much more interested in maintaining command of these European forces through the NATO alliance than encouraging Europe to go its own way. But one form or another, under Emmanuel Macron, you should expect to see greater military expenditures in France.
And Laure, does this victory give Monsieur Macron the mandate to become a more commanding figure, do you think, on the global stage? Would he like to be seen as a shuttle diplomat between Moscow, Kiev, Paris, Brussels?
Well, Emmanuel Macron during the past 5 years has showed that he likes to play an important part.
He likes a spotlight, certainly.
Yes, and likes to lead discussions, negotiations.
Is he any good at that?
Well, he hasn't got, I think, any tremendous results, but also because
he hasn't got any results.
Yeah, but also because we live in a more complex world where probably it doesn't take just one European leader to.
But he's not big enough and commanding enough to really get that authority, is he?
I'm not sure it's a question of personality or authority, maybe just a question of the difficulty to balance between his European commitment and also the will to discuss with the US or China or Russia. These are complex situations, but I'm sure Emmanuel Macron will still engage a lot in these international matters, even though they are not really interesting for him in a domestic perspective, because French voters polls show that French voters are much more interested in employment or cost of living or security, and not so much caring about what Macron does on the international agenda.
Laure Cometti and Douglas Yates, many thanks to you both for talking to us here on The Agenda.
Thank you. You're welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. In the first round of the French presidential election, more than half the votes were cast for candidates of the extreme left or right. And in the final runoff, Marine Le Pen came closer than ever before to winning the Élysée. Now, that may not mean the French are closer to overturning democracy, but it does illustrate a deep alienation within France, even the fracturing of a common understanding of what it means to be French, evidenced in the huge vote for the far left in the Parisian suburbs, the banlieue, and for the far right in country areas. And this is an election held before the effects of a cost of living crisis are fully felt across the West. The inflation and lower growth now in prospect will provide easy rhetoric for those who want to argue that entire economic and political systems have failed. In the end, Emmanuel Macron eased back into the Élysée. And it was a considerable achievement, making him the first president to win a second term since Jacques Chirac in 2002, and the first with a parliamentary majority, thereby having full control over the government since Charles de Gaulle in 1965. And there was, it seems, general antipathy towards Mr. Macron, particularly among younger voters, which meant that turnout was crucial. Even so, a second term is likely to prove even more challenging than the first. His ambitious domestic agenda, including much-needed pension reform, can be expected to trigger further protests. That is in part a reflection of the extent to which France has become even more polarised over the past 5 years. And for what Mr. Macron does next, his first electoral task is to win the parliamentary elections in June, so his party can form the next government and legislate, a task that looks far harder than it was 5 years ago. Then he must get on with economic reforms at home, foster a stronger foreign policy, especially pushing Germany to be tougher with sanctions and arms, and to find ways to bolster the middle ground of French politics, for example, by placating grumpy rural voters. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, hunting the unicorn, where to look to invest in a billion-dollar startup. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.